All right. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I'm the Executive Director of the Horological Society of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our September 2021 meeting. And first off, of course, welcome back. This is our first in-person event in 18 months. So it's been a long road, and I'm really thankful to everyone who's stuck with us through the pandemic and tuned into our Zoom lectures, supported us virtually. We're really happy to be back here in person, both for our lectures and for our classes. So as usual, let's get started with some announcements. So what did we do over the summer? What HSNY news happened? First off, we want to welcome our newest partner organization, the Willard House and Clock Museum in North Grafton, Massachusetts. I heartily recommend everyone to go check out this fantastic museum. It's a incredible place. It has so much there to see, so much there to learn about early American horology, specifically clocks from the Willards. So absolutely go check it out. We look forward to working with them closely in the future. We're also welcoming Parmigiani Fleurier as a sponsor. You can see our sponsor grid continues to grow, many brands joining, and we're very happy to welcome Parmigiani, who's a very famous watchmaker from the Vallée Travers, right? Is that correct? My pronunciation is maybe not perfect there, but thank you to Parmigiani for their incredible support. Other news, what else are we doing? We just announced our chronometer certification program. So this is a testing program that we're doing right here in New York. We're testing chronometers and issuing certificates. Yes, we're very excited about the chronometer certification program. You're going to see a number of watches coming out this year, later next year, from a variety of different brands, all advertising HSNY certified chronometer. So that's a really exciting development. An education update. Really happy to announce that we've restarted our in-person New York evening classes, our horological education classes, and they are happening every week. We had our first one on Tuesday night, and our Director of Education, Steve Eagle, is here. Steve, you want to wave to everyone? And he had a very successful first class on Tuesday, so that's very exciting to get students back into our classroom on the 5th floor. We also are restarting our traveling education classes. The first stop is San Francisco, October 9th through the 10th, hosted by Shreve & Co. And I was really excited to try and encourage everyone to let their friends in San Francisco know about the tickets and to purchase a ticket, but I just saw on my phone they're completely sold out already. But we're excited to go to San Francisco and just generally restart our traveling education initiative. And of course, virtual classes are still available. If you can't make it to New York, if you're not in San Francisco, we can come to you virtually. All right. I've got to give a quick shout out to our friends at Watch Time. Watch Time New York is happening October 22nd through the 24th at Gotham Hall. I always look forward to that event. It's a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing them restart in-person events as well. And speaking of in-person events, the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart is our annual gala. And the Horological Society has been holding its annual gala every year since 1866. 2020 and 2021 were the first years that we ever had to cancel our gala. So I'm really happy to announce that we are going to be holding it in 2022. So save the date. It's our 156th anniversary gala, Saturday, April 9th, 2022. And it will be at a brand new, very exciting venue that we'll reveal to everyone when the time comes. All right. I also want to give a quick shout out to everyone tuning in online. This is the first time we've ever live streamed a lecture. So we're recording it. We're also live streaming on YouTube. So it's great for everyone joining us online. Welcome everyone joining us here in person. This is This is very exciting, and thank you to David, our videographer, for making it all happen. All right, on to tonight's main event, on to the lecture for the evening, the history of the tourbillon, its theory and modern evolution. So what is the tourbillon? What is a tourbillon? If you study watchmaking, if you've looked at some of the beautiful watches back here in the display cases from our friends at Breguet, you know that a tourbillon is a mechanical device that increases the precision of a watch, right? But there's more to the story than that. There's a lot more. And tonight we're going to take a deep dive into the history of the tourbillon with two of the world's experts on the subject. First is Mr. Emmanuel Breguet. He is a direct descendant of Abraham Louis Breguet, the inventor of the tourbillon. He's the vice president, head of Patrimony at Breguet, and he lives in Paris, France, and works in the Vallée de Joux, Switzerland. And then, of course, Jeffrey Kingston, editor-in-chief of Le Quai de l'Horloge from Sun Valley, Idaho. Jeff helped me with that pronunciation beforehand. So Jeff is here in person to lecture with us, and Mr. Breguet will be joining us via video from Switzerland. All right, so please join me in welcoming Mr. Emmanuel Breguet and Mr. Jeffrey Kingston.
Good evening, everybody. This is actually 18 months behind schedule, I think, of when we were going to be doing this particular talk. We flattened the curve for 2 weeks, and then we all know what happened. Unfortunately, Emmanuel Breguet wasn't able to get entry into the United States to be in person at my side to give his part of the talk. So what we have done is we filmed him at Breguet's Vallée de Joux offices, and we'll present the film that he recorded a couple of days ago. And so without further ado, let me turn the screen over to Emmanuel for his delightful talk.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the prestigious Horological Society of New York, I'm quite sad and disappointed not to be able to be in person among you in New York today. But be sure, I'm very honored to share with you through the air and the modern technologies the historical part of this fantastic adventure, which is that of the tourbillon. 2021 is an anniversary for the tourbillon, and it was very exciting for me to take this opportunity to do some new investigation about it. In a few minutes, Jeffrey Kingston will share with you the technical side of the invention, as well as its contemporary and future developments. For my part, I'll try to paint the historical and the philosophical context of the birth of the invention and of its early days. As a short reminder, who was Abraham Louis Breguet in 1801 when he obtained the patent of his invention from the French government? Not a beginner, not a young man. He is a 54 years old prestigious watchmaker, a recognized personality with 25 years of tremendous activity behind him. Already twice, he revolutionized watchmaking, both technically and aesthetically. Self-winding watches, gong spring for repeating watches, improvement on the existing escapements, new escapements, anti-shock device, Breguet overcoil constitute the first batch of his improvements to technical watchmaking. Closer to 1801, he has invented tact watches to tell the time by touch, the modern travel clock with spiral balance, the sympathetic clock, the constant force escapement, to mention only a few. From the aesthetic point of view, he has created a new design, purer, very sober, white enamel dial with Breguet numerals, guilloche dials, thin watch cases, he really introduced the neoclassical style in watchmaking. The qualities and the influence of this design, as you know, are visible until this day. Politically, he lived through the last years of the Ancien Régime, of the French monarchy, delivering many timepieces to the French court, especially to Queen Marie Antoinette. And during the worst period of the French Revolution, he found himself forced to come back to Switzerland for 2 years. And at the beginning of the new regime, under Napoleon's rule, he is ready for a winning comeback. Tourbillon. What is the core of the invention? A keen connoisseur of the laws of physics, Breguet observed the effects of gravity on watches, which at the time were worn not on the wrist, but along the body and therefore in a mainly vertical position, impairing the regularity of the watch's movement. And while Breguet could not alter gravity, he could perhaps tame its effects and maintain the accuracy of the timepieces, whether in an upright, tilted, or horizontal position. As he explained himself to the Home Minister in the letter he submitted on Christmas Day 1800, some people do work on Christmas Day, I have successfully compensated for the anomalies arising from different positions of the centers of gravity and the movements of the regulator. I succeeded in distributing the friction all over all areas of the circumference of the pivot of this regulator and the holes in which these pivots move. This is done in such a way as to ensure of all chafing parts should remain constant despite the thickening of oils. Lastly, I eliminated many other errors that impair the precision of the movement. But why did Breguet name this clever invention with the name of tourbillon? The name of tourbillon. Interesting question. Far from its modern meaning of violent rotation, the word tourbillon in the 18th century referred to what the Descartes Treatise or Diderot and D'Alembert Encyclopedia describe either a planetary system rotating on a single axis or the energy that causes the rotation of the planets around the Sun. In choosing this word, Breguet resembled the 18th century philosophers who considered watchmaking comparable to the creation of a miniature universe. To me, the mechanism of the tourbillon is actually a tiny, tidily ordered constellation which combines devices for the regulation, I mean the balance spring, and for the distribution of energy, I mean the escape wheel and lever, both within a mobile carriage which spins as constantly as any planet. Now, a few words about chronology of the production quantities clients. Assuming that the idea for the tourbillon took root in Breguet's mind between 1793 and 1795, during his time in Switzerland, 6 years went by between his return to Paris and the granting of the patent of June 26, 1801, or Messidor, year 9 of the French Revolutionary calendar. And 6 more years elapsed between obtaining the patent and the first sales, which were a long time in starting. While this might seem a long time, even today, as we know, certain watchmaking developments still take many years to come to fruition. This quite long time suggests that Breguet had perhaps underestimated the difficulties of fine-tuning this new type of regulator, another result of his well-known optimism. The considerable expenses and the sacrifices that the inventor also mentioned in his patent application did not end in 1801. It took Abraham Louis Breguet more than 10 years to develop his extremely complex invention and to make it reliable. He mentioned his invention at every opportunity and promoted it as well as possible at the French industrial fairs held in Paris in 1802, 1806, and 1819. Convinced of the significance of the invention, which could be installed in different types of timepieces, Breguet and his staff went on to produce 40 tourbillons between 1796 and 1829, plus 9 others, which were never finished and appeared in the ledgers as written off, scrapped, or lost. Through research on the available archive material has made it possible to draft a precise list outlining the history of each one of these pieces. Out of these 40 tourbillons, 35 were watches. About half of those has a carriage revolving in 1 minute, as the patent described. The other half revolved either in 4 or 6 minutes. The other 5 tourbillons were a sympathetic clock with a tourbillon regulator, a clock and watch set made for Sommariva, a large-scale model for demonstration purposes, a naval chronometer, and a travel clock. And now, who bought these? Unsurprisingly, monarchs, George III and George IV of England, Ferdinand VII of Spain, Russian aristocrats such as Princess Demidov, prominent European personalities such as Count Potocki from Poland, Prince Hardenberg from Prussia. Many of these buyers had known Breguet for a long time and were true connoisseurs. Little mention has been made until now that a quarter of these 40 tourbillons were used for naval purposes. In other words, they were bought by ship owners or sailors and used for navigation at sea and for calculating longitude. An explorer in Africa used the watch for the same purpose, and Thomas Brisbane reached Australia with his. Some pieces were used on the global ocean for half a century. Several pieces even belonged to leading scientists. Clearly, and in line with Breguet's own classification, the tourbillon fell into the category of watchmaking for scientific use rather than watchmaking for civilian use. The tourbillon, a success? Question mark. Equipped with a gold or silver case, these tourbillons were works of art, the aesthetics of which match their technological brilliance. Although they were considered to be purely scientific objects, they were given a sophisticated finish. The dials of the tourbillon are among the most beautiful in the history of the house. Constant second, seconds on demand, power reserve, sometimes even a thermometer. Not two models were the same. Production was very slow. In 1802, once the patent had been obtained, work began on 6 tourbillon timepieces. The creation of each of these pieces would take between 5 and 10 years. In 1809, taking advantage of his booming business and hoping that the opening of his branch in St. Petersburg would also open the Russian market for him, Breguet started work on the production of 15 new tourbillons, half of which were completed after 1814. As for the prices, in French gold francs of the time, they do not seem excessive, far from it. They are indeed within the range of Breguet prices, as is the margin taken by the house. The simple models with a silver case and a tourbillon carriage rotating in 1 minute were sold for around 2,000 francs, while models with complications, including a running second hand and a small second display that could be activated on demand, a finely decorated gold case, and a tourbillon carriage turning in 4 minutes, went for between 3,000 and 5,000 francs. To compare, a repeating watch at the same time would cost between 2,000 and 2,400 francs. A simple watch costing between 1,200 and 1,800 francs. In the end, why did Breguet only make 40 tourbillons? Perhaps his lifelong quest was, above all, to improve the functioning of timepieces. While the making of the tourbillon was complicated, he also found other ways to achieve his goal and preferred simplicity to complication. And the tourbillon, this fantastic invention, the shooting star in the watchmaking sky, the brilliant idea born of the Enlightenment, had to fade. But about 75% of these 40 original tourbillons have survived, an incredible proportion that speaks volume regarding the fascination they exercise. And where can you see them? A dozen are preserved in museums. 3 belong to the collection of the Breguet Museum. 5 are kept in the British Museum and other museums in England, while the others can be found in Italy, Switzerland, Jerusalem, and New York. A further 15 pieces are in private hands, and in recent years, 2 have appeared at auction. After A.L. Breguet's death, the tourbillon never disappeared completely. In 1890, for example, Breguet, the House of Breguet, made a tourbillon travel clock for Alexander III of Russia. 30 years later, it began producing several new tourbillon pocket watches that were sold from into the 1950s. But only a very small number of insiders knew of this. The revival, when it came at last, was as swift as it was unexpected. Also, designed for pocket watches, Abraham Louis Breguet's invention made its fantastic comeback in the mid-1980s, but it is another story. And my friend, Jeffrey Kingston, is the one who will enlighten you about this part of the story in a few seconds. As much as in the days of Abraham Louis Breguet, enlightened connoisseurs still wish to contemplate the beauty of his invention and to delight in the finest expression of horology, when it composes a symphony of science, harmony, and poetry. Thank you very much.
I want to start our technical discussion here with a brief history of World War II. I see a couple of very distressed looks. And it's probably well justified, actually. However, it probably also cements my reputation here at the Horological Society as being somewhat of a madman, because I started my talk in 2018 about dive watches with Victor Hugo, and here we start talking about tourbillons with Adolf Hitler. But I'm going to tell you my short history. The short history of World War II is the Germans and the Japanese started it, and they both lost. Now, what does that have to do with tourbillons? Because much of our discussion of tourbillons is about that deep. So here we are. This is the way tourbillons are talked about by most watch collectors, by most people in the industry. This is the phrase you see. The tourbillon addresses small rate errors caused by gravity. Undoubtedly correct, just like my history was undoubtedly correct, incontestable, it's true, and we can leave it there and all go home. But if we want to go a little bit deeper than, let's say, the 50 characters that were in that particular sentence, or a little deeper than Instagram or things like that, we can. And where should we start? Logically, everybody is going to focus on the balance wheel and hairspring because they're the parts that are moving with the tourbillon. But that's really not the place we should start. We're going to get there. That's going to be very prominent in our discussion as we move forward. But we should really dial back a little bit and get down to basics. And I want to change the way in which you normally will think about a watch. Because I want you to think about the watch as an oscillator. Because it's going to be principles of oscillators that teach us what we really should know and really think about when we got the tourbillons. For a very long period of time, well before balance wheels and hairsprings came along, we had grossly inaccurate watches. My friend Jack Forster likes to say they still had oscillators. I don't tend to think of them that way because I don't think it meets the classic definition of an oscillator. That really came with Christian Huygens, who brought us the balance wheel and hairspring invention. By the way, those old watches before Christian Huygens were so inaccurate that there were many that were outfitted with something far more accurate, which is a sundial. And if you go to the museum in Geneva, you can see some of these very, very old pocket watches. They were almost the size of little table clocks with the sundial, which would tell time. But so Huygens invented the balance wheel and hairspring. That's what's made our watches of today possible, truly. But he didn't start there. He conceived of that, but his starting point was pendulums. Now, there's a lot to talk about, and I want to get some basic concepts in front of you before I put a pendulum on the screen. The first thing is something called restoring force. When you have an oscillator like a pendulum, when the pendulum is displaced, gravity is going to pull the pendulum back. And that force that takes the displacement and moves it back to what is the zero position, which is where it really wants to go, and it will, of course, go past that. That is the concept of restoring force, and that's going to be very important as we go a little bit deeper. The next concept is equally important, which is how does the rate of the swing relate to the amplitude of the swing, Will it be the same whether the swing is wide or whether the swing is narrow? Keep that in mind, because that is going to be a key concept as we go in deeper, and that's going to bring up the term of isochronism. So if we have an ideal oscillator, ideal, key word, if we have an ideal oscillator, the amplitude of the swing should not affect the rate. That's what we're striving to achieve, and that would be called an isochronous oscillator. So now I'm sorry to say I've got to bring some basic, if you were very advanced in high school or early university physics to bear here. This is now a depiction of the pendulum, and this is the place where Huygens' thought really began. There's a problem with pendulums. Gravity is shown with the line down here. Now, for those of you who remember your physics, you would recognize that to be a vector. A vector is a force with a direction, and of course the force of gravity is going to be straight down. But that is not the direction that is going to bring the pendulum back. That is not going to be the direction of the restoring force. That has to be along the arc. And what gets to be critical then is the angle. So the restoring force is going to be the sine. Do you remember sine, cosine, all of that stuff from trigonometry? It's going to be the sine of the angle. Here's the problem with pendulums. The problem with pendulums is that the sine function is not linear. So as a result, the swing of the pendulum at bigger amplitudes is going to change the rate as compared to small amplitudes. Now, we do have some very accurate pendulum type clocks that people have developed, but what they do is they reduce the swing of the pendulum to really the bare minimum. And at that stage, with the angle change really not all that great, they get something close to an isochronous oscillator out of it. But for larger displacements, that's not going to be true. It is not linear. It's therefore not going to be isochronous. Oh, by the way, one of the interesting things that Huygens did with a pendulum, he recognized that as a problem, and so he developed little bellows, let me go back, little bellows up at the top here to change the effective length of the arm of the pendulum. And so it would have the effect of shortening the arm to compensate for the angular problem that we have been talking about. Kind of clever, very clever man. So his answer to that was the development of the balance wheel and the hairspring. As he conceived it, in an ideal way, the restoring force would be proportional to the angle. So we've solved the problem of the pendulum because in an ideal setting like this, it would be isochronous. So it wouldn't matter whether the balance wheel was having big swings or little swings, the rate would be the same. Or said another way, the rate would not vary with amplitude. But keep in mind, this is an idealized balance wheel hairspring. So let's take a look at a balance wheel now with its hairspring, and keep in mind I'm talking about an idealized balance wheel. If you want to know the way in which you would mathematically think about it, the restoring force, which is always critical now when we're analyzing this problem of isochronism, is going to be a function of a constant, which is shown up here in the formula as C, which depends on the characteristics of the spring. Is it a stiff spring? Is it a flexible string or not? And the angle. But that does yield a linear relationship between the angle and the restoring force, which makes it isochronous. Of course, in a watch, we have two things going on, don't we? When the balance wheel swings, you have the spring trying to bring it back, which is the restoring force. you also have the impulse coming from the powertrain, which makes it swing in the first place. So you have both of those going on. In an ideal world, if we could have an ideal implementation of both a balance wheel and a hairspring, we could have a perfect isochronous oscillator, because it shouldn't matter whether the force diminishes coming through the powertrain or not, because the amount of displacement as the balance wheel rotates doesn't affect the rate. We could have an ideal rate where the rate would not change depending on the state of wind of the watch. But, of course, we don't live in an ideal world. And there are a number of key perturbations which are now going to impact this wonderful system which Huygens gave us. Breguet was recognized, and you heard Emmanuel Breguet talk about his many inventions. You know, we have the tourbillon, we have the Breguet overcoil, we have the gong springs for a minute repeater. He actually was the first to create a split-second watch. We know about all of his aesthetic inspirations, such as Breguet numerals, the guilloche on the dial, the fine hands, the thin watches, and all of that, which makes him, I think, without too much contest, the greatest watchmaker who ever lived. But I want you to think of him in different terms, because he was a scientist. He was admitted to the French Academy of Science, and the depth of his analysis and scientific study of how these oscillators works was truly magnificent, and that's why he deserved his nomination into that prestigious body during his lifetime in France. There's another aspect to it. Breguet was a Jacobin, which meant, I guess if we want to translate it into the modern idiom of our politics of today in the United States, you would say you could call him a moderate Democrat. Well, the French Revolution wasn't led by modern Democrats. It was led by hardcore, rather brutal radicals. And so when the revolution ended and we had a booming business in guillotines going on in France, a mere Jacobin was not going to be a very safe person, and so Breguet fled to Switzerland for 2 years. So here he is, he's away from his workshop in the Quai de l'Horloge. He's completely isolated from his business. He doesn't know when he's going to be able to come back. He doesn't even know if he'll be able to come back to France. And what does he do? He does a lot of the big, basic scientific work that led to the creation of the tourbillon, which is extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary when you think about all of those circumstances that he faced. And he came up with some very profound insights. So the first one is that he understood that the balance wheel hairspring would have an off-center center of gravity, and that was going to affect the way in which it would perform. Another thing to ponder for a moment. Today, we could put a watch on a very sophisticated timing machine, and we could see that. But those timing machines didn't exist during his lifetime. And it's hard for me, and I think hard for most people today, to imagine how could he have come to that kind of understanding when he would have to analyze the timing of a watch and its errors over a considerable period of time to discover what was influencing the running of the watch. Really remarkable. The second one is that he understood, and these are all coming from his description in his patent, which was granted in 1801, that the distribution of friction for the balance staff was having a profound effect on the running of the watch. And kind of related to it, the effect of lubrication and unevenness in lubrication in the running of the watch, and that was also producing errors. All of these three things are very nicely described in his patent filing. These all affect the running of the watch because they produce torques. And let's take a look at that. So on the left side of the screen, we have our ideal case, the one that Huygens probably had in his mind as he created the balance wheel hairspring. On the right side, we have the real world. And in the real world, the center of gravity, unfortunately, particularly when you look at a spring that can't be in a perfect circle, it just can't. It has to have an end at one side and an end on the other side. So the center of gravity is going to be displaced from the center of rotation. And that means we've got the gravitational vector here, which is now, in this particular circumstance, adding to the restoring force coming from the spring itself. That is a perturbation. We have taken the system that should be perfect and we've made it imperfect because the center of gravity is not where you would like it to be, which is in the center of rotation. So this is that look in a little further mathematical detail, if you will. So here we have our center of gravity, which is displaced. Now, several things affect that perturbating torque. One of them is how far displaced is it? That's the lever arm. The closer you can get it to the center, the less the effect of that perturbating torque that is otherwise interfering with the normal restoring force of the spring itself. And then, of course, we have the angle. And it's going to be the cosine. And so you see the formula here, which looks at the lever arm, how far displaced is it, how great is the angle, and we have the formula showing the cosine of the gravitational vector now interfering with the normal functioning of the hairspring. The second element that Breguet identified was friction. So if you imagine this is the pivot of a watch on the left, here is the balance staff, which is sitting inside a jewel. Now we've exaggerated a little bit the size of the hole in which the pivot is going to exist. But if the watch is in a stationary position, it's going to be rotating in one position around this jewel. And if that jewel is not perfect, the friction in that position might not be the same as the friction in a different position. Breguet's idea was the way you get around that is you have perfect distribution of friction by rotating the jewel. So if the jewel rotates, meaning this part of the watch is rotating, then you're going to have the balance staff seeing all the different interior parts of the jewel. And so we have now gone through the parts with higher friction and lower friction and the torques that come from that as the watch rotates. And this is really about the same analysis you would have for the related error that he identified, which is how does the lubrication get distributed? Are there spots with more lubrication versus spots with less? If we rotate it all, we're going to take care of that. So I'm going to use a particular watch here, which is related to the one I'm wearing actually right now. This is a skeleton version, and I picked this one because if it's skeletonized, we can see a lot more than if it weren't. This is a modern Breguet, a Breguet perpetual tourbillon. Is it possible to dim the lights a little bit? Because I think we'll see a little better. That's better. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Nate. So, by the way, if you're looking at the watch here, there's one thing I do want to point out. The skeleton work is extraordinary because when you think about the task of finishing a watch like this, you're going to be doing finishing on not only the outside of components, but the inside of the components. And if you look at the form of what is left here, you'll see a lot of very sharp, what are called interior angles. And you can only do this kind of work if you do the very traditional hand filing anglage on the edges of the parts that you see. Because if you use the faster expedient, which is used almost everywhere else, which is a rotating tool, you can't get a sharply defined interior angle. It has to be done by a succession of very, very fine files followed by wood with a very fine abrasive. But let's get back to tourbillons. So the key here to understand is that we're going to address these perturbating forces, which is gravity from the displaced center of gravity, the friction anomalies from the way in which the balance staff sits inside its pivot, and also the issues of lubrication by rotating everything. And the question is, how is that really accomplished? So in this particular case, you have here the exterior carriage, which is going to be carrying around the balance wheel, the hairspring, and the escapement. And it's going to rotate, and today almost all tourbillons rotate in 1 minute as described in the original patent. So the rotation is what is going to ameliorate the effects of the three elements that we talked about. The way in which it occurs is, you can see here a gear train coming down to what is a pinion behind here. So that's the powertrain of the watch, which will engage a pinion, which will rotate the carriage of the watch. And of course, that's fundamental to the operation of a tourbillon. And it is going to, as well, carry around with it the escape wheel, which you see here, and it's engaged with a fixed gear behind. And as the powertrain delivers the energy to rotate the carriage, that rotation is timed by the balance wheel, and the whole assembly moves around the fixed wheel. That's the key principle of the operation of the tourbillon, and how, with that one powertrain, we both operate the escapement and we do the rotation, which is key to being a tourbillon. Now, I want to play a short movie for you here, and I want you to be patient. I'm going to put a tourbillon onto a timing machine. And it takes a few seconds here. This is about a 1 minute, give or take, film, which will show you how this rotation is going to move the operation of the watch through the fast positions and the slow positions, the positions where gravity is tending to speed it up, or these other anomalies are tending to speed it up, and those positions where the opposite is true. So it'll take just a minute for things to stabilize, and then you'll see it start to go. And by the way, that you can see the tourbillon movement down here on the machine. So we're stabilizing in terms of the way in which the timing machine is going to record things. So we're at this point now moving down to the point where these perturbating torques are slowing the rate down. And then as the rotation continues, we're going to go into those positions where it will have the effect of speeding it up. This will look a lot like, because it's what it is, a sine wave. And this illustrates the basic principle of what goes on with the tourbillon, which is we move it through fast positions and slow positions. And that's the way in which we cancel out the effect of the torques that speed it up and the torques that slow it down. That's as close to a sine wave as you could have. Now, I've got this same film speeded up, so maybe we can see it all a little bit quicker. Here's our speeded up version. A sine wave. Now, there have been a number of things which go then beyond the tourbillon itself that, combined with the tourbillon, will improve timekeeping. One of them is the overcoil. Now, the overcoil is, here's our hairspring. The overcoil takes the end of the hairspring, and instead of fixing it with an arm that would come out and grab its end, the overcoil is raised above, that's why it's called an overcoil, and then it's actually fixed at its far end closer to the center. That has the effect of taking the displaced center of gravity that we have been talking about and bringing it closer to the axis of rotation. And if you remember the way in which we showed the effect of the center of gravity, one of the elements was the length of the lever arm between where the center of gravity is located versus the center of rotation. So the effect of the overcoil is to move it toward the center so that that effect is actually reduced by the overcoil itself. Another part of the evolution, and this is the same watch just in a different color metal, is to make the hairspring out of silicon, or if you read a French publication, it would be called silicium in French. And you can see the overcoil here. Now, what are the advantages of having a silicon hairspring? Most people, when they talk about it, the first thing they say is it's anti-magnetic. A metallic hairspring like Niverox or one of those kinds of alloys, of course, is subject to residual magnetism if it encounters a strong enough magnetic field, and that interferes with the characteristics of the spring. Undesirable. Silicon will reject that because it is not a magnetic material, and therefore that's an improvement. But for timekeeping, honestly, since we don't walk around in big magnetic fields all the time, there are many more important advantages that come from having silicon. One of them is it's lighter than a metallic hairspring. Why is that good? If the center of gravity is displaced, if it weighs less, that center of gravity will be less important. And therefore, the perturbating torque from gravity will be smaller. That's a big advantage. Another advantage of silicon is that its response to an impulse, which is what the mainspring of the watch delivers via the powertrain to the balance wheel, is more uniform. And therefore, as the mainspring unwinds and as the amount of force, the amount of torque being delivered to the balance wheel is reduced, its response will tend to be the same, much more so than a metallic hairspring. That's another advantage, and again, that improves timekeeping. So we're adding things into our tourbillon here that make the tourbillon better than what it would have been using a metallic hairspring or a hairspring without an overcoil. There's one other element to it. I want to show it to you with actually a balance wheel and hairspring, not from a tourbillon, but it will make the point. With silicon, we can do something you can't do with a metal hairspring. The way in which you make a metal hairspring, the way in which you fabricate it, is you start with wire and you make it thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and eventually you wind it up and you get the form of the hairspring that you want to see. Its thickness along its length is going to be the same. You can't make it thicker in some spots than other spots. But that's not ideal if you're engineering a perfect hairspring combination with the balance wheel. You might like to have some spots be thicker and stiffer and other spots be more subtle. With silicon, you can do that. You can engineer the hairspring and its characteristics to meet the design that you have. This is actually from the Breguet Chronométrie watch. It's actually two hairsprings. But to get to a more idealized hairspring, what they've done is they attach the thick part here, but they make the center where the flex will start quite distant from it, because that's a better position than what they would have otherwise. And as well, you can make the interior portion, which is actually done in the hairsprings you saw in the tourbillons, have an ideal beginning of where the flex will be. And that's what's called a Grossman curve, where you manage to get, again, the hairspring better centered at its flexation, if you will, better centered around the axis of rotation. And with silicon, you can do all of that. Titanium, that also brings some other advantages and is important in the evolution of the tourbillon as we come into modern times. First element of titanium, which is very useful, is that it's lighter than a standard balance wheel. What does that mean? It would mean that the friction would be less important because we don't put as much weight, if you will, on the pivots. That brings a big advantage. And another advantage is you can make the balance wheel bigger. What you want with a balance wheel is you want to have inertia. And inertia is going to be a function of two things: the mass and then the radius of the mass. And if we have lighter mass, we can make the radius bigger and get the same amount of inertia that makes the watch run better. What inertia does for a watch is that it makes the running, if you will, more even, less likely to be disturbed by some external force. What Breguet actually had as one of his philosophies was to make a watch thin. That was very important to him. It was refined, it was more elegant, and today those same values, I think, hold true. Extra thin construction is a part of the evolution. How do you get to extra thin with the tourbillon itself? So on the left, we have the tourbillon that we saw earlier, where we have the cage, which is above the fixed wheel in which the escapement is engaged as it goes around, and the power delivery is also behind the carriage. To make it thinner, what Breguet has done is that the carriage here is engaged with a wheel on the outside of the carriage, which is down here. So instead of engaging with the powertrain from behind, it's engaging right in the same plane in which it exists. We've eliminated that thickness there. And the thickness that would come from the fixed wheel is eliminated in a similar way, in that the escapement is engaged with a fixed wheel in the same plane in which it is. So again, it takes a lot of ingenuity to get to the thinner construction than what was traditional, if you will, for the way in which you built a tourbillon. I'd like to say this is a modern invention for a tourbillon and a way in which to improve its performance, but in fact it's not, because here is a Breguet pocket watch from his lifetime with a constant force fusee and chain. And some of you may know what a fusee and chain is and how it works. A brief explanation. What you have is the barrel of the watch driving the watch through a chain that is connected to something that looks like a bicycle derailleur here. And it works on the same principle. When the watch is fully wound, the barrel is going to pull this pie-looking contraption from its small diameters, and then as the mainspring force diminishes as the watch unwinds, it moves to the larger diameters, just like you would do with a bicycle derailleur, that compensates for the loss of torque coming from the mainspring barrel. And today, they're built in the same way. This is the Breguet La Tradition tourbillon, and you can see the fusee, which is here, and the chain, which is connected all the way across to here, which is the barrel. And as the barrel is fully wound, it will be pulling from the small diameters, And as the barrel unwinds, it will move down to the larger diameters, and that will compensate for the change in torque. There actually are a couple of interesting elements that you don't see when you look at this. The first is, how do you protect the chain from overwinding? We have a small, incredibly delicate chain inside the watch, and when you wind it, you're going to be turning the fusee to pull the chain back to the barrel. So how do you protect it? And the way you protect it is a small device down here, a small finger that will come into play and block the fusee from turning too much. It will block it and protect you from breaking the chain from the force of turning the crown. The second element, which is kind of interesting, and I haven't seen anybody ever talk about it, which is, how do you keep the watch running when you're winding it? Because you're moving everything in the backward direction. And the answer to that is, there is hidden inside the fusee a differential, so that as you wind it, it's also delivering energy to the watch in the right direction and keeps the watch running. So that's our little explanation and exploration, if you will, a little bit longer than the history of World War II, about how a tourbillon works and the different ways in which it addresses these problems of timekeeping. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeff. That was amazing. Time for the Q&A portion of the evening. If anyone has a question for Jeff, please raise your hand. We'll go right back here to Rob first.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks. That was great. Is there room for evolution? Do watchmakers today currently have goals that they want to achieve, or do you think it's like we've reached the peak?
I don't think we've ever had an invention in the history of mankind where we say we've reached our peak. So, yeah, people are working on ways in which to improve. You know, we've seen the effects of technology. We've seen silicon here. We've seen titanium here, and the way in which they've been brought to watchmaking. There is a philosophical divide. And the philosophical divide is, at what point would you bring so much technology to these handmade wristwatches that they won't feel like a mechanical watch anymore? Will they feel like a quartz watch, which nobody wants? So you have to think in terms of what technology will still respect watchmaking, which we all love, and keep the spirit of watchmaking alive without going too far. We have seen in the past few years a few watch companies that have come out with watches that I think utterly kill any notion of it being a mechanical watch. I don't want to name names, that would be impolite, but they're out there.
Okay, I also want to let everyone know that's tuned in online on YouTube. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box. We will get to it. We have another question here in the back of the room.
Thank you. Your thoughts then on double and even 4 sets of tourbillons? Does that more is better, more law of averages?
How can I put it? They're visually interesting to look at. They are connected by differentials, which in theory will average things out. I don't know that 4 is that much better than 2. I don't know that anybody has shown that. At some point, I think if you get to 4 of them, that they start to become more complicated just to keep running than maybe any benefit that you would get from timekeeping.
Okay, thank you for that question. Thank you, Jeff. We've got our first online question. I'm pulling it up here on my phone. This is from Chris Dolert. Are there metrics on how much precision a tourbillon delivers in a modern watch compared to a simple lever escapement?
Well, first of all, the tourbillons do have lever escapements, or most of them do. Here's the problem I always have when you get a question like, are there metrics? Because you can take a simple watch that has no tourbillon in it, and you can build it to absolute perfection, and you can tune it and tune it and tune it and tune it, and you'll get a great result. And you could take a tourbillon and maybe not be very careful in how you build it, and you would say, gee, it doesn't work as well. At some point, it becomes a function of how carefully in which the watch is made, and that's why sometimes these timing competitions are a little bit deceptive. They're not grabbing a watch at random from production by the watch company. They're taking a watch that has been submitted to them by the watch company to win. So at some point, they're not really representative, and I don't think we can generalize. A fabulously made watch will run fabulously well is the best answer I can give.
Okay. Any other questions in the room? All right.
Thank you. Not specifically on Tourbillon, but in general, Breguet at the time or watchmakers at the time, how did they manufacture parts so small and so precise without the machines and lasers that we have today?
There are actually people who do that. When you graduate from, first of all, at Breguet's time, they weren't making wristwatches. And an important perspective to have when you think about wristwatches today is that we're, in many, many respects, duplicating things that were made in the scale of pocket watches at the time. And there are big problems sometimes in reducing from the scale of a pocket watch to the scale of a wristwatch, because the components become much, much, much smaller and more difficult to make. Most people, when they graduate from watchmaking school, make a school watch where they're supposed to make all of the components by hand. So we still can. There's still that savoir-faire that's around to do it. And it's part of good training for a watchmaker to make that school watch with every single part made by hand. And that would be the way in which they would have been done historically.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple more questions coming from our online audience. And this question is, Jeff, you'll know, maybe this is a teaser for something happening in the future. Ethan Lipsig asks, how does the carousel compare with the tourbillon from a timekeeping standpoint?
The principle of a carousel and the principle of a tourbillon are the same. They both are seeking to ameliorate these perturbating forces by rotating the timekeeping components of the watch. And in fact, there's only one carousel which is being produced today, and that's made by Blancpain. And it rotates the escapement and the balance wheel and the hairspring, all of that in 1 minute, just as a tourbillon would. The difference between the two is the way in which you accomplish that. With the tourbillon, the powertrain is delivered to rotate the carriage, and it also is supplying the energy for the escapement. With the carousel, you have two powertrains that come to bear. One causes the rotation of the carriage. The second one powers the escapement, and there's no fixed wheel. If you want to get down and think about the principle of a carousel, it's really a differential. I mean, this is really getting complicated at this particular point. There is no inherent advantage one over the other. They're just two different ways of doing the same thing with the same goal in mind, and basically a similar type solution, just different implementations.
Okay, thank you for that. We have one more online question from Seymour Rivers. Seymour asks, while winding the crown, it activates a differential, as you mentioned.
Yep.
And as soon as you're not winding, is the differential unlocked?
The differential is never locked, so it can just turn by itself at that particular point.
All right, I've got a question, something that I was wondering, and this is actually from Emmanuel Breguet's presentation at the beginning. There's one very early Breguet pocket watch that says whirling about regulator on it. And it says whirling about regulator. And I've seen this watch sometimes, and it seems like maybe that's an English translation of tourbillon. It's a whirling about regulator. Have you seen that phrase used anywhere else besides that one very early pocket watch?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of, but that would be a question for Emmanuel.
Any other questions from here in the room? All right, we'll go back to Rob.
Sort of simple. Difference between flying tourbillon and regular tourbillon?
Okay, that one is fairly simple. The original tourbillon, as described in the 1801 patent, had a bridge below and a bridge above carrying around the assembly of the carriage, the balance wheel, the hairspring, and the escapement. So it's suspended between two bridges. A flying tourbillon has no top bridge. It is being held up by the bearing assembly at the bottom only. So they call it flying because that top bridge has been eliminated.
All right, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Jeff. You got a question? Okay. A couple more questions in the room here. Can you pass it?
Hi. Would you classify a tourbillon as a complication? And if not, what would it be exactly?
Two answers. If you want to pick up some watchmaking texts, they would hold that a complication is something that a watch does beyond timekeeping. So a simple date window is a complication. A large second hand is a complication. A tourbillon, because it is central to the timekeeping, technically, by that set of definitions, isn't. However, every person I know in the watch industry disagrees with that. So they understand that complication was really intended to describe a watch which is complicated, which is more difficult to produce and more sophisticated than the simplest timekeeping that you could imagine. And so therefore, by that analysis, a tourbillon would be considered a complication, and I think almost everybody in the industry talks of it and thinks of it in those terms.
I agree with you when you say it's a debatable topic, and we'll agree to disagree on that, Jeff.
Okay.
We have another online question. This is from Super Duper Steve. That's a great name. Is there a particular reason why the tourbillon did not become like a standard part, standard feature in all wristwatches that we see?
Because it's, you're going to hate me then, complicated.
Yes.
It's difficult to
Yes.
produce, it's expensive to produce, and therefore it is, put in the constellation of some of the most sophisticated, difficult things that we do when we create a wristwatch. It's a reason why not every watch is a perpetual calendar. It's the reason why every watch doesn't sound the hours, minutes, and quarters.
All right, it's a good explanation. I think let's maybe have one more question. Was there one other question in the room that I saw? Okay, let's go here.
It seems like certain manufacturers tried to attain accuracy by speeding up the movement, high speed, high frequency movements. Was that something Breguet considered, or are there sort of trade-offs between doing it that way and doing it with a tourbillon?
Well, when the idea behind a higher frequency movement is that if there is a perturbation, which would come from a shock of changing when you move your watch, you're perturbing the running of the watch. You're bringing forces on it just from the movement, right? The movement of the watch physically itself. At a higher frequency, the perturbation from that dissipates quicker than at a lower frequency. So it's an advantage. But there's a disadvantage also that comes from higher frequency, which is you unwind the mainspring faster. So at some point you decide where you want to make those trade-offs fall.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. This was an amazing lecture. This was an amazing night. Our first night back with an in-person event. So I really want to thank you for making the trip out to New York. And that's all. Please give Jeffrey Kingston a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so that's it for tonight. Just a brief word about what we're going to be doing during this transitional period, getting back to in-person lectures. Due to travel restrictions around the world, some months we will have a virtual lecture. In other months, if maybe the speaker is domestic here in the US, we will have an in-person event. So the reason I bring that up is because our October lecture is going to be completely virtual, but we will have an exhibition part to that event happening upstairs. You'll hear more about that very, very soon. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone online for our October lecture and then back here in person in November. Thank you all very much. Have a great night. Yes, absolutely.